Welcome to Will's Personal Development Podcast, where we bring you data and science-backed answers and advice from billionaires. What's up, everybody? Welcome to Will's Personal Development Podcast. In this episode, we are going to be focused on something really special, a specific billionaire, and what I learned from his book that I read. Now, this is a special case because I think our podcast as a whole has kind of been touching on specific how-to topics, but I kind of want to reel it back to specific case studies because those are very practical. They have real world examples, and more so importantly, a huge trend I've been seeing in podcasting, and this has always been the case, is that most successful podcasts center around interviewing, at least in the self-help space. They seem to. They tend to be just interviews of successful people. And it's very individual focused rather than topic focused at times. Or if it is topic focused, it's centered behind a specific super successful person who can kind of back up their claims. Therefore, I thought it would be incredible. It might be more beneficial to the podcast audience, and it maybe just be more beneficial as a whole if I went back to some of these case studies of billionaires and really, deconstructing and discovering their patterns. I do believe that I am in the top 1 percentile of people who have read the most and studied the most billionaires. I mean, I've watched so many videos and interviews of billionaires. There's 100 books by billionaires, written by billionaires, and I think I've read more than most people. I haven't read them all, but I've read more than 99% of people out there. There's only like maybe 2 or 3 people I can think of on the internet. Some of them with very small blogs, one with a podcast, the Investors Podcast. They do a lot of billionaire reading too. However, I think I'm up there, and that's not to say it's like the most impressive thing ever. I'm not trying to brag here, but I am saying that I may have some credibility. I may be able to sift out patterns that aren't there, and there are clearly patterns that make billionaires different from millionaires. There's quite a few, and it really separates the wheat from the chaff in the sense that some millionaires, like it or not, they lucked out. They got their first $1 million by lucking out in some way, shape, or form, even if they don't admit it. And it's much harder to do that when you're going for $1 billion. And it's incredibly, you really have to know what you're talking about, what you're doing, and so forth. And of course, there are 1 or 2 lucky billionaires. One could argue one is Mark Cuban, who pretty much, made it all in one go by selling broadcast.com to Yahoo, and then Yahoo finding out it was completely useless. But either way, there are patterns, and specifically in this podcast, I want to focus on a billionaire by the name of Sumner Redstone. That's Sumner Redstone. I chose this one for many reasons. I think a huge issue with a lot of the wealth studying or wealth advice is that it's highly focused on a few select examples from the most well-known famous millionaires and billionaires. And that's the problem. It like focuses on this like small sample size, the small data set, and then just kind of uses those specific stories, the Bill Gateses, the Warren Buffett's, the Steve Jobs. By the way, Steve Jobs, I don't think he was ever truly a billionaire. He was a millionaire, but a billionaire, I don't think he ever made it there. Yes, his company is the most highly valued company with the largest market cap now, but that's because of his whole team, because of his predecessors, because of a lot of things. In the sense of pure money accretion, he didn't even hit $1 billion potentially. And of course, correct me if I'm wrong, but that's incredibly interesting. So, in that sense, he may not be up to par with some other successful business people. Nonetheless, I chose Sumner because he is one of many interesting billionaires that are not in the limelight often. And the problem with just focusing on the, popular ones is that you had a very skewed idea that's wrong and biased and just, false, because you're just focusing on just like one or two case studies of how billionaires are and how they interact and how they see the world and why they succeed. And so, cross-referencing it with all these other people is really important. And also with Sumner, he did it in a different way. Many billionaires, they kind of build it over a long, consistent lifespan by kind of buying and holding really good businesses. Warren Buffett is a great example. John Paul DeJoria. I think that's one of my most admirable ways of becoming a billionaire. One of the ways I like the most, because it's so honorable and ethical, and it's about slow, steady progress. But Sumner he did it differently, and I kind of want to show you how, there's different pathways to it, and also kind of like give you a different personality, a different type of billionaire, just to show you that they're people, and people are different. Another final thing before I just launch into these notes I have about him is that this man and the book he wrote, it's a short read. So this book is actually, it's very easy to get online, on Amazon, on probably even at your library, which is why I picked it up. I think it's easily accessible but highly overlooked, which is, I think, a huge tragedy. The fact that many books by billionaires, even though there's over 100 of them, do not ever get read, even though there are so many thousands of, aspiring entrepreneurs. Instead, they read the books that are well marketed, the books that are businesses in of themselves, where they're trying to make money by getting the book in your face. The 4-Hour Work Weeks, the Lean Startup books, the E-Myth Revisited books. And maybe they are good books. Those books have inspired a lot of people and helped a lot of people, but I still think it's a tragedy that because, these other business people who are technically 1,000 times, 10,000 times more successful than the authors of those other books, they're overlooked because they wrote these books really just to help people rather than to market them and promote them to make money. And therefore they get lost and forgotten. And this book, A Passion to Win, that's the title of the book, by Sumner Redstone, is one of these books that just got overlooked, and it's tragic. No one reads this. No one knows about this. He has all these, secrets of success and making money in there, and no one bothers to read it. It's a bit of a tragedy. So it's double-sided. I also understand how tough it is to break into the book industry, and Tim Ferriss did a spectacular job from being a nobody with very few achievements to, breaking into the scene and being one of the top names in the podcasting and book industry. So, props to him, but also, it's still nonetheless a tragedy. And I'm kind of hoping to even the playing field a bit. So let's just get into it now. So Sumner Redstone, who is he? He has a net worth of over $5.6 billion, according to Forbes. If you don't believe me, you can search on Forbes.com yourself, and it will have it there right for you as proof. This book and this, story really surprised me for a lot of reasons. And I'll get into them. The first big thing is that there's nothing that was too redonkulous. There's nothing that was strange or weird or like eye-catching. And I think that's something that's really important to beat into everyone's head, which is that sometimes it's not about crazy, fancy stuff. It's not about some type of weird magic potion or secret trick that you've never heard of before. This guy, at his core, he had very solid, fundamental success traits that you've probably heard before. but you've never mastered, you never really focused on. And I think most people underemphasize the importance of fundamentals. And it may seem cliche, but that was the big takeaway from this. He emphasized so much throughout the entire book, so much the fundamentals of success, so much so that it got repetitive. He just kept emphasizing certain specific skills and mindsets. And it's stuff that you've probably heard before. And I'm going to, mention them, but, you might overlook them. You might gloss them over, but they're really important. Now, nowadays, everyone's writing blog posts about the secrets to success, and therefore they've expanded all the success traits that you need. There's like hundreds now. It's like, oh, you got to do this. You got to never give up. You have to be positive and blah, blah, blah. We're not talking about that fluff and that crap. We're talking about specific, a handful, maybe 3 or 4 specific traits. And then the first one I kind of want to mention is live a frugal life. Maybe you've heard this before, but there you go. This guy is a billionaire. He was, he owned Viacom, which was a parent company of many companies that you've probably heard of. Nickelodeon, Nick at Night, Paramount, Blockbuster. He was definitely in the entertainment industry. So this guy was like huge. Like I remember as a kid, I was enthralled by these TV shows, Nickelodeon, Disney Channel, and Cartoon Network, and MTV. And even back then when I was young, I had a little bit of like a business taste to myself. So I would always kind of like theorize and ponder, and I'd be like, these TV channels are just killing the game. They're absolutely dominating. No other children's cartoon or children's TV channel comes close. And I was just like thinking about how incredible these are and how they almost had a monopoly on the business. And then YouTube happened, of course, and now it's a different story. But before then, I was just like, whoever owns these companies, they must be making a killing. And I didn't know any better because I was a little kid and I don't understand. But apparently, Viacom owned most, if not all of them. Like, this company was a powerhouse in the entertainment industry, and Sumner Redstone owned it. So back to living frugal. This guy, he was super rich. He has thousands of millions of dollars to spend, or at least $1,000 million. And yet this guy was pretty darn frugal, which is something that Warren Buffett was as well. As with many other billionaires, Warren Buffett still lives in like the same house he bought 40 years ago. And Warren kind of does it for other reasons. It's just like in his genetics or DNA, or to kind of just live frugally. Also, he subscribes to a really admirable life philosophy that I agree with, which is that you shouldn't just buy stuff to buy stuff, because sometimes having more or having stuff that you don't need or truly want or really gives you value in life actually detracts from your quality of life rather than helps it. So you don't want to just buy stuff that are fancy or expensive because you see other people have it, because that's not always the answer. You really have to ask yourself, do you get value from it? And for Warren, he has said numerous times in interviews that he gets no value from something that others might, like a yacht or a huge mansion, because if anything, it'd just be a huge hassle for him to take care of and pay the car and the mortgage payments on and the house cleaning payments, and hope nothing gets broken and no one steals anything from his house. So he just thinks like the whole maintenance fees, it'd be more of a hassle than what interests him. And I think that's very admirable and very wise, because people are different. There's so many different types of people in this world. There are people who really like fly fishing. There are people who really, really enjoy going outdoors and kayaking and rock climbing. And then there are people, and I'm kind of like this, where, I'll go outdoors slightly, but mainly I sometimes just want to sit in my room on my couch and watch Netflix, and maybe go, occasionally go outside and sit on a tropical beach. So we have all these different tastes and dream lives that are sometimes radically different from each other. And therefore, You shouldn't choose someone else's dream life. Just because one person, really likes expensive cars, maybe you deep down don't get any or little value from that and you would rather travel the world. Or maybe you're normal like I am and you have normal interests rather than crazy interests like Warren Buffett and, he loves reading books all day. I like reading to an extent, but I have a lot of normal interests too. I'm not like some crazy, Bill Gates type guy who loves programming and will do nothing else. I like video games, TV, all the normal stuff. So therefore, in terms of living modestly, a Netflix account and maybe, renting a few video games could be enough for me. You don't have to spend excessively. And of course, obviously, when you spend less, you get to save more, which allows you to invest it and earn more. So for Sumner, I think he was probably slightly more so like Bill Gates. Bill Gates, he has a really expensive mansion, so he clearly spends more and indulges from the money he makes. But Sumner, I think from what I could tell, he had a taste for spending, but he restrained it. Unlike Warren Buffett, where he just didn't have the taste for spending to begin with, Sumner had a slight taste for spending, not excessive, but he kind of restrained it. So for him, he was a lot like Warren Buffett. He lived in the same modest house he bought like 40 years ago. He still wears secondhand suits, which is like, it really gets you thinking. Like Warren Buffett also wears like secondhand cheap suits. And the only expensive suits he's gotten, which I found out about in a interview in his latest, it was actually after the shareholders meeting. He had like a mini interview after by CNBC, and I found this on YouTube. But the 2016 shareholders meeting, someone caught Warren Buffett after the interview, and he kind of talked about, it was before the shareholders meeting actually. He pretty much revealed that the only expensive suits he got were gifts from other rich people. But for most of his life, when he was still unknown, where he was just this like unknown billionaire, not the world's richest person, Warren Buffett also wore like secondhand suits. That really got me thinking. It's kind of like, do I really need to spend like excessive amounts of money on fashion? Some people, I think Neil Patel, he's a entrepreneur. He did like a split test, for like hundreds of his sales calls where he wore like a really, really, really expensive suit, like thousands of dollars. And then like he wore like, shirt and tie or, t-shirt and jeans. And he found out that the suit converted more and got more sales. And so he kind of concluded that expensive suits are worth it. I would have to, based off what I've seen from these books, I would have to kind of disagree slightly. I would say that like you get rapidly diminishing returns after like maybe $500 on a suit. So, it clearly shows you that you don't need to go overboard with, presentation on the aesthetic sense to make $1 billion or more. Another thing, he lives a very modest life. Sumner has no mansion parties, nothing crazy. He's never really, excessively spent his money. This really reminded me of Jeff Bezos of Amazon and Sam Walton of Walmart, both of which have books. Jeff is the Everything Store and Sam's is Made in America. I went through both of those books by very incredible billionaires, and they also are kind of eerily in the same way, very frugal, especially when it comes to unnecessary business costs. Warren's also very similar in this sense. Like, there's a few shareholder letters he wrote, Warren Buffett, where he just went on this rant about how other companies will just like waste the money they have on stupid stuff like marble tables and like really expensive plush leather chairs. And it's like the worst return on investment ever. And it's like one of the ways companies fail. So he, like, even when he was a kid, cause I went through his, autobiography, at least a quarter of it. That was a long autobiography. It was too long to finish. But I went through a quarter of his autobiography titled The Snowball. And I found out that when Warren Buffett was young, like a teenager, he was the same way too. Like, he bought like, it was like one of his first stocks. And one day he was able to visit New York City with his dad, and he toured one of the like executive board meetings, and he just got really, really mad because he found out, he saw these executives, you know, handing around these really expensive cigars and smoking them and just having a chat. And he just got so mad as a kid because he was like angry that these executives were wasting the money of his company on this stupid stuff. So it just really gets me thinking. So a clear pattern I'm seeing here is frugality. Frugality. Jeff Bezos, even when he was like worth $1 billion, when he would go, there's this one scene in the Everything Store where he literally like stays at a Holiday Inn and has dinner with his guests, these high level business executive guests from Walmart, for this really high level, high priority, high stress negotiation. He had the freaking dinner at like Applebee's or something like really cheap. Like, it wasn't like McDonald's, of course, but it was not super expensive. And then he like stayed at a Holiday Inn and he bought like everyone else like very cheap Holiday Inn rooms, even though he was worth like $1 billion at the time. And I think maybe that's a bit excessive, but I think, the point is that like they're moderately to extremely sensitive of business costs. Now, of course, there are other companies like Alphabet/Google who are kind of like testing out different stuff because they've figured out that, hey, if you spend a lot of money, Facebook is the same way. If you spend a lot of money to take care of your employees, it will come back to you. So with Facebook and Google, they have like these huge campuses with like gourmet food and buffets and massages and daycare and your laundry done for you. But I would argue that it's not contradictory because with Alphabet and Facebook, Alphabet is Google's parent company. Even with these companies, what they're doing is they're focusing their extra spending directly on a return on investment in employee satisfaction. That's very different from just blindly spending on furniture, like marble tables and leather chairs for your company's facility. And that marble table example was specifically referring to when Warren Buffett was ragging on banks, really posh banks that were spending the money they earned on stupid stuff that wasn't really helping or taking care of or appreciating their employees. It was just kind of like, hey, we got these really expensive marble tables and furniture, which arguably is more beautiful on an ambience level for maybe customers, but maybe that's too much. Maybe that's overboard. So that's my thinking about this. Frugality is something that's really important. I mean, Jeff Bezos could have easily spent like $1,000 to $50,000 a night for a hotel room. He didn't. Okay, what's another one? This one is rather, what's the word? It's cliche, but huge. This man truly had a passion to live and win his whole life. This is something he emphasized throughout his whole life. Here's how Sumner, I think, is incredibly different from many other successful people. Many successful people have what's called like a hero's journey, a specific story where, you know, maybe they're mediocre in life. They're just kind of plodding around life like zombies. And then one day some horrific event occurs and maybe it's a life-threatening illness or some type of wake-up call, and it changes themselves, and then they become this like super hardworking person, and then they save the day and become a billionaire. That's not the case with Sumner Redstone. In fact, at the age of 55, he was caught in a horrible building fire that left him scarred with third-degree burns all over his body. 40% of his body was burned off, and he went through like a dozen surgeries. The pain was unbearable. And the ridiculous part about it was like, of course he survived. He was grateful. He went through a long period of really tough physical therapy. But the difference was when he came out of that, he was like, okay, that was tough, but it didn't change a thing. Like, I don't feel like that. Sumner was like, I don't feel any different. I don't have any regrets. I don't, there's nothing that I wish I did that I didn't do. And the biggest thing was that he said that he had this huge passion and drive to win before this like life-threatening fire enveloped him. Like, he did not need that. Like, it was not a wake-up call for him. And like, that's what he stressed at the start of the book. He was like, he basically said that you don't need to go through a life-threatening event to start to live. You start when you want to. So he was saying, like, for him, from the beginning, he had this undying passion to just live and just kill it and just like win at life and become successful. And while other people required some type of life-threatening illness to trigger that, if you read S. Truett Cathy, the founder of Chick-fil-A's books, there's a bit of that trigger in his books when he had like a life-threatening cancer, which really made him a bit, I wouldn't say it changed his whole behavior, but it made him a lot more grateful for stuff. And then he survived that and went on to found one of like the most successful private fast food chains in existence, Chick-fil-A. But that's very different from Sumner. And I think it's a huge lesson. Like, you don't need to induce some life-threatening event to cause you to really want to like crush life. And for Sumner, that was the case. This guy was one of the toughest people ever. If you check this out. So as a child, Sumner attended one of the toughest schools in the nation, Boston Latin. This was like some type of like super school. It was extremely competitive. Like, the world's smartest people went there. It was a pure meritocracy. So like, if you perform well, you rose across the ranks, and that was it. There's no discrimination based on race, religion, or gender there, but it was ruthless. The competition there was just like ruthless. Sumner had to develop like an intense, insane work ethic there, or he wouldn't survive. The drawback to that was like he didn't have any social life. Like, he studied every second of the day. He didn't even know the names of like the classmates that sat next to him, except for like one guy, because every day that guy sat next to him in one of his classes. Everyone else he didn't recognize. So I think that part was a bit overboard. I think it's important to have a normal life, because if you put too much on a child, you could be psychologically screwed up later in life. I mean, look at Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart or Michael Jackson. Like, they didn't have a childhood, and then because of that, they became really strange adults who kind of try to relive their childhood as adults. So he didn't have a social life. I think that was maybe overboard, but he also had an insane work ethic, because everyone else there had an insane work ethic. A lot of other people there had no social life. So like, if he didn't study, or he fell behind and slacked off for a few seconds, that was an opening for his competition to get ahead. He graduated number 1 in the class, went on to Harvard. At Harvard, he was actually disappointed, not impressed. Most people think of Harvard and they're like, oh, that's the most competitive place on earth. Instead, he was incredibly disappointed because the drive to win, as he calls it, in competition wasn't up to par with Boston Latin. So I found that incredibly interesting. And I think it's also something that is huge. I've experienced this myself. I've heard of other millionaires experience something similar. There's this one entrepreneur. I don't know if he's a millionaire, but he's pretty successful. He definitely makes 6 figures or multiple 6 figures. This guy's name's Ben Settle. And Ben Settle was very similar. He has a podcast called the Ben Settle Podcast. And in a recent episode, he talked about how he pretty much used to hustle all day, work 18-hour days. And he would have to do so much stuff. And he had to he would pump out 15 blog posts and emails and all these projects in a single day. And he slept 4 hours a day. And what happened was, when he scaled back to just doing one project a day or one project a week, it was easy for him. It was a piece of cake. And his whole point was that if you put on a lot, when you take it off, kind of like Goku from Dragon Ball Z, where he put all this armored weight on himself, but when he took it off, he felt so much lighter. And what most people consider normal, or what most people consider tough, it becomes easy to you. So by putting on more initially and then taking it off, you readjust your frame. So that's kind of what he did, and it worked really well for him. And now he has clients and followers who complain about doing one project a day, and he just rolls his eyes. And I've experienced this too, and I think this is a great lesson. I've experienced this in multiple ways. I used to run track and field. I got up to 5 miles a day. And now when people complain about running a mile, I can't help but, roll my eyes in my mind a bit, because, I endured and I went through, all this training, with, not that much respect or, praise or anything, reward other than my own, fulfillment from it. So it was, when I went back down to just running a mile a day, it seemed so easy now. And I've also experienced this in terms of just work-life balance. I used to intern for a startup company, a tech startup company, and the hours were just crazy. It's 8 a.m. in the morning, and it would go sometimes all the way until midnight or later. And there's no stopping. It was just nonstop work around the clock in these open workspace environments where everyone was on a computer. And of course, you didn't have to work all that time if you didn't want to, but it was kind of just the culture and vibe of the place. So for me, it was just when I went back down to a 9-to-5 work day, it was, I wouldn't say a walk in the park, but it was much easier compared to what I had experienced before. And when I heard everyone else my age complaining about working 9-to-5 and 40 hours a week, I sometimes can't help but roll my eyes slightly. So you get the point. This guy really had a passion to win. He really leveraged this whole idea of putting on a lot of work and, demand. And then once you get used to that and you have that work ethic, taking it off, and you just become so much lighter and faster and better. Okay, so now we're getting the juicy stuff. Here are some tips that I think will be really impactful. So Sumner also gave some hiring tips. He says he looks for just 3 things when hiring executives. These are the same 3 ingredients he thinks create success. 1, a passionate commitment to your goal. 2, courage and dreams to take risk. And 3, the moral and intellectual character to realize the dreams worth pursuing and the best route to take to achieve them. And he calls it his 3 C's: commitment, courage, and character. I found this incredibly interesting. I think this may just be a example of evolutionary convergence, perhaps, because I don't think if this is eerily similar to Warren Buffett's 3 things he looks for when hiring. And I don't think they've talked to each other or really, been influenced by each other, yet their criteria are eerily similar. Now, there are differences, but it's eerily similar. It's the same number, 3, and one of them is pretty much almost on point. Warren Buffett, his 3 are hardworking, smart, and honest/ethical. And he says if you don't have the third one, you don't want them to have the first 2. You want them dumb and lazy. You don't want a smart, hardworking, unethical guy working for you. So his honest and ethical one is like the theme of Warren's life, and it just so happens to be one of Sumner's criteria too. I think his point about the moral and intellectual character to realize the dreams worth pursuing and best route to achieve them, character, C, is kind of similar. I mean, it's not a 1-for-1 comparison or a complete match, because Sumner kind of also talks about the ability to map out and identify the best route to achieve your goal, and the intellectual character to realize the dreams worth pursuing. So there's definitely differences, but I do think that morality is an important thing that I encourage everyone to look for when hiring employees. And I don't think this is something that most managers, from what I can tell, really look for. Like, I've been on both sides. I've interviewed people and I've been the interviewee many times. And when I do get interviewed, like, that kind of gets passed up. Like, they just ask like these cookie cutter questions and then they just call it a day. And sometimes nothing about morality is even questioned or asked or tested. So I think that's really important. That's one huge opportunity to get ahead if you know about the importance of that metric. The other one, courage and dreams to take risks. That's different. So courage is not something that is on Warren's metrics, but that's pretty cool. Risk taking. And then the third one, a passionate commitment to your goal. So Warren says smart, hardworking. Smart kind of goes with intellectual character. Hardworking, not really mentioned here. But Warren's also all about passion. He's all about follow your passion. It may not be his 3 main criteria, but I know it's also in there for him. So there's definitely similarities here, with what they look for in hiring. Stick to what you know. This is another piece of advice that I think, this guy really learned from his mistakes. And I think that's one of the best things that you can do from reading books. It's learning multi-million-dollar mistakes to save you millions of dollars. And so this guy, Sumner, he pretty much was a lawyer. He went to law school and then he was a lawyer. And he was a really successful lawyer, like one of the best lawyers ever, one of the highest paying lawyers ever. And then he decided to go into business. So, the mini lesson there, it's not too late to change careers. And that's what he did. He went into business, which, a lot of people thought he was stupid to try, but he did it anyways. And, he does not believe in diversification. He says, instead, you should focus your time and money on a few businesses that you know well. Very similar to Warren Buffett's philosophy. Again, and again, it makes sense. Like, if you spread yourself too thin, because there's so many different industries and businesses that are completely different, like, your knowledge and your wisdom gets spread thin. Like, how are you supposed to juggle all these different companies and know that it will do well in the future? So, when you reduce and you focus your time and effort, you're more likely to succeed. So he also says that, in terms of investing as a whole, it just requires a lot of confidence in general. So if you do ever invest, you really have to have confidence in yourself and what you're doing. It's just part of the game. Keep that in mind. Sumner pretty much made his money through a few huge investments and reinvestments into a few select big businesses, which many of which had child businesses in them. So these were sometimes large, sometimes small conglomerates. And he only made like a few big acquisitions like this in his lifetime, but it paid off. And I think another huge thing he did as this investor was he poured a lot of his money back into these businesses. And he owned and operated them himself, so he understood them from front to back, back to front. I think a lot of investors or wannabe investors these days, they just kind of like, they know the surface level stuff, but they really don't know the ins and outs of how the whole business works, and they can't really do all the roles in the business. So that's huge as well. Now, with Sumner, I think it's also incredible to note that with him, he also was really good at identifying these businesses, and he would hold them for long periods of time, sometimes never sell them, and wait them out for decades, kind of like Warren Buffett. Sometimes he would sell, but he would hold them for a while, even when others were saying, oh, this business is toast. And it just goes to show you, like, when he has faith in a company, he really holds it for the long term. He really has a long-term strategy, which is, I think, something that is essential to most wealth creation on the highest scale. If you look at the most richest people in the world, they had 1 or 2 or 3 companies and they held them indefinitely. They were owners and they stuck it through thick and thin for decades on end, whether it's Mark Zuckerberg with Facebook, Bill Gates with Microsoft, Warren Buffett with Coca-Cola, or Geico. He's never selling Geico. He's said that numerous times, even though he's held it for like 30 years. American Express as well, he's had for like 20, 30 years. He's not selling it no matter what. More so for, well, there's a lot of reasons why he's doing it, but you get the point here. Michael Dell with Dell, they held on to these businesses. They weren't just like flitting around and buying and selling random stuff and trading the days away. Now, I want to touch on his ability to identify a winner and identify which businesses would succeed as an investor. I think this is incredibly useful advice. He was like, he mentioned how he invested in MTV. Now, at the time, MTV was like the channel, the TV show for teenagers. Like, it was an incredible show. It was the face of the youth of America. Millions of teens across the world were watching this. This was before YouTube or the internet, really. So, like, this was all they had. The problem was, like, people were saying, like, this is the TV show, that this TV channel wasn't going to make it. Why? Because MTV wasn't making much money. Even though it was getting a lot of views, there's a lot of issues with it. It was this new thing. They were growing, but they weren't sure how to monetize yet. It was a different type of TV channel, much more edgier. And what this guy did was he was like, you know what? You can sit in your room and look at the numbers and all this crap. I'm going to go to the actual headquarters. And he went to the headquarters, and immediately, like, you could, just by the feeling, the ambience, the environment, he knew that this place had something going. Now, keep in mind that he was already pretty old at this time. So he wasn't part of this teen generation, but he could understand the passion behind it. And that understanding of the passion made him a lot of money. So he walked around this headquarters and it looked like a college dorm. There's CDs cases everywhere. It was kind of messy. It had a really like young vibe to it. And he could tell this was a huge opportunity to capture a powerful up and coming generation. And I think you can apply this advice it's almost timeless. As of this recording, the new up and coming generation to capture would be millennials. And so you can apply it to that generation, and so on and so forth. So this guy, he loved the vibe. He understood it. Even though he himself didn't listen to this music, he preferred like older genre and generation of music. He still loved the spirit. He understood it. And, he pretty much, acquired MTV, even though they weren't making much money. I just find that incredible. On top of that, he knew not to mess or change with an incredible culture. So like, I think one of the founders of MTV asked him like, hey, when you acquire this thing, are you going to like change it up so we can't like, be messy and have like CD cases everywhere? And he's like, no, keep doing your thing. And I think that's crucial. That's really crucial. Like, you don't want to just destroy a culture and be all corporate and boring. That's going to ruin it. So he really understood that. And, more so than that, he really, kind of like, Charlie Munger, he really understood and valued the qualitative aspects of a business just as much, if not more, than the quantitative. And most people, even these days, they're so focused on just the quantitative. In his book, he said that when everyone else was measuring companies like MTV, all they cared about was like the numbers behind their tangible assets, like the radios, the video cameras, and the lights they had. But he measured companies by their content. What shows were they producing? Were these shows valuable? Were these shows engaging? Were these shows mind-blowing and drawing a huge audience? It seems so obvious, but still to this day, no one other than maybe Gary Vaynerchuk, I can think of, really, understands this deeply. Another huge thing, he says, immediately after he saw Star Wars, like the first ever Star Wars movie, he walked to a payphone across the street and bought 100,000 shares of the parent company that was responsible for Star Wars. That's a bold move. Like, I don't even know about that. Like, that's something left field. And I wouldn't say that you should take any advice or make any impulse investments from that. It's just a cool comment, and I would be very cautious of doing anything like that. As you can tell, I'm more so of a Warren Buffett investor because his philosophy just makes a lot more sense. And I mean, there's a lot of danger to such impulse investing without really getting to understand the company and doing your research. But nonetheless, it goes to show you that like when you really see something amazing and you feel it emotionally, and you respect the qualitative parts of a business too, it could be a beneficial factor to put into play. Okay, moving on. Do what you're passionate about. Now, this has been beaten to death. And as I said, even though it's cliche, it's legitimate. It's still mentioned here, even by billionaires. So it's just a good point to go back to your fundamentals, realize that this is just more proof that it's true. But he says, for him, Sumner just says, very few people who are motivated by money make lots of money. And maybe for some of you, you've heard this many times before, but I don't care. It's a really good lesson. It's something that needs to be beaten in your head and reminded of. And you really have to fundamentally understand it, because otherwise it's just going to go to the wayside. Like, you're going to look for some shiny, fancy tactic, neglect the fundamentals, and you're not going to succeed. So stop looking for the fancy tactics. Really ask yourself and get this question right. Are you passionate about what you do? Do you really love it? And then from there, once you've got that settled, you can look for some other secret to success, but focus on the fundamentals. Sumner himself says you have to have a stronger motivation than money, because otherwise you can't succeed with it. Sumner was making $100,000 a year as a lawyer back in the day, like the olden days. And inflation adjusted, it was about over $1 million a year. So he was like the highest paid lawyer of all time at the time. But he got bored of it. It just became like clockwork to him. Like, he knew what was going on, and it just became all about the money. And because of that, he made a hugely important role, which is he moved on to start his own business because he wanted to get the passion back. And that's a critical pivot point that most people don't make. They get stuck in the money, and then they're just miserable. hating life all the time. There's this one guy, that Ty Lopez, another podcaster and YouTuber, constantly mentions. And he's never mentioned by name specifically, but it's some mysterious friend of Ty Lopez. And basically he keeps referencing this guy and saying that like this guy makes like $1 million a month, but he hates his job. He hates his business. He hates everything about it. Like apparently it's like in a horrible industry where, you're exploiting others to do it. Like, I don't know if it's exploiting others by giving them unhealthy food or what, but like he hates it. And he wakes up every day and he hates his life from the moment he wakes up, yet he can't walk away from the money. Like his greed overpowers him, and he's like, he wants to do something he's passionate about, even though he's made more money than he will ever need for the rest of his life. For some reason, he can't walk away from all the money he's making because even though he hates it. So that's just a lesson for you guys out there. Like, don't make the same mistake. Like, when you're making that much money, like, there's more to life than just earning more money. Like, if you don't use it, it's useless, basically. Like, at some point you have to use it. Otherwise it's just paper. So you might as well use it to live a life you're passionate about. Don't make the same mistake. Here's another thing that's really profound that Sumner says. There's also an essay by Bill Gates back in like 90s that said this, and I think it's even more relevant as of today. Like, given all that's going on with social media and podcasting and blogging and everything else. So Bill Gates, he wrote this whole essay called "Content is King," where he pretty much said that like content is like the most important thing in the new era. Good content, that is. And Sumner has his own quote about this. He says, "Content is king and always will be." So basically, Sumner invested in a lot of companies that are still recognizable today, like Paramount and Nickelodeon. And it wasn't because of some like weird executive structure or like, the performance of the leaders there or some weird reason that he invested in these companies. It was simply because they had the best, the most incredible, the most amazing content. When I think about modern times, there's one company that just stands out above everything else, and that's YouTube. Their content is user generated, and the incentive system is just incredible. Some YouTubers make millions of dollars, and because of that, they put out incredible content for free to do that. So I can't think of anything that comes close to YouTube. Maybe HBO, maybe Netflix, but in terms of the modern day, as of this recording, the new content is king winner in the entertainment field is YouTube. So this is more of an investing tip or business tip for entertainment-based industries. But arguably, before you go off and say, "Oh, well, I can't use that, I'm not in the entertainment industry," Gary Vaynerchuk, another successful entrepreneur, he's been saying for years that everyone's in the content industry now. Because now, even if you're a plumber or a pizza guy or a painter, you can create your own YouTube channel or social media and give tips and entertain yourself and entertain others with videos and tutorials and articles on how to do plumbing and, entertaining ways of plumbing and going viral and building a following to get more business. So everyone's in the content business now. So in that sense, it is applicable to any business. Okay, so I have a lot more tips here, but this podcast is getting really long. So there's a few other kind of miscellaneous bonus tips that I will have on my blog. These bonus tips include some advice he gave on negotiation, how to get investors to invest in your products, including how he got the producer of The Godfather, widely regarded as one of the best films of all time, to fund a movie for him. There's also a few tips on how life doesn't have to be downhill when you get old, and how Sumner was having the time of his life in his 60s, and a few other pretty good tips on how to be a good builder, how to not be a bad operator, how to create incredible, fabulous content, and so on and so forth. So these bonus tips will be in the show notes in the actual article counterpart of this podcast. So if you just go to willyouLaugh.com/Sumner-Redstone, you'll find it. Otherwise, if you just go to willyouLaugh.com and you just use the search bar and you search Sumner Redstone, you'll find it. You could probably find it on Google too if you just search Sumner Redstone space willyouLaugh.com or Will's Personal Development Show. Like it, you'll find it. Any of those ways, you'll be able to find this those bonus tips on the article. So I highly suggest you check it out there. Also, I'll leave a place to enter your email address on the article, and if you do, I will give you a free checklist of all these secrets to success that I learned from Sumner Redstone and his book, A Passion to Win, so that you can, print out, put on your refrigerator, carry around with you, whatever else have you. And by doing so, you also subscribe to my exclusive email newsletter where I post some of my most profound, impactful bits of advice that I share nowhere else for free. So that's what you get. If you want even more awesome stuff from me, Will, I really hope this podcast helped you. There's a lot of great stuff I learned, and it was a very short read, this book, and there's a lot of fundamental basic stuff I've heard many times before, but also a lot of subtle things about content production, investing, industry trends, and how to extend the lifetimes value of a customer. He really has this intergenerational thing on a lockdown. Basically, by buying different age group TV channels. So I think it's incredibly interesting. Like, this guy was a beast. He made his money in a very unique way by pretty much acquiring companies and then restructuring them. And just doing this a few times with some really big deals and being an incredible negotiator and choosing the right companies that other people thought wouldn't go anywhere, and having faith in these companies and being an incredible negotiator. Like, the last quarter of the book, I'm talking the last whole 25% of the book was like purely on like his final negotiation for his like largest acquisition ever. And it was literally like, there's a lot of good negotiation stuff there because he went through the ringer to get that deal done. It was a huge acquisition. Now, it wouldn't be a complete book review if I didn't say what I didn't like about the book. And there's just one big main thing, which was that he did have a bit of an ego to him, which I didn't like. I like Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger better because they don't have egos to him. There's a few remarks he made during the final part of the book where he, kept talking about like how he wanted a huge statue to be sculpted and put up for him after his acquisition, and how, he was kind of jealous of this other rich billionaire he met because that guy had a bigger statue than him. And I don't really subscribe to the whole ego thing. I think there's certain parts of ego that are evolutionarily advantageous, which is why it's there. But, that level of blind ego, I think Charlie Munger said it best. It really can come back to bite you and hurt you. So that was the real big thing I didn't like about this book. I think there was a few negative traits of his that I don't think helped him become a billionaire or, make you the best person. But it is what it is. hopefully you like this. Hopefully it was a breath of fresh air. I would love if you reached out, left a comment on my blog with some positive, constructive feedback. Any questions you have, anything really, leave a review on my iTunes. It really helps. You go to willyoulaugh.com/podcast. That would be incredible. And I hope to see you in the next podcast episode. Now, of course, this is a very young, burgeoning, small audience type show. So I really encourage you, if you have any positive feedback, to go ahead and send it to me, because your chances of getting answered are much higher compared to some like crazy far off top podcast, which you send in a question, no one's ever going to read it. So I'll be looking forward to hearing from you. Hopefully this helped. Would really love your feedback on what type of episodes or stuff you'd like to hear from in the future. Other than that, see you later. Thanks.